Hello! In this lecture, I will tell you about language variation and change. In this first part of the lecture, we will talk about language varieties. Language varies. Different people and different communities speak in different ways. We as linguists can describe any type of language as long as it has a consistent structure, as long as the variation is systematic. And then it doesn't matter if it's a full language, such as Arabic, French, English, or Japanese, or whether it's a language spoken by a subset of speakers. For example, Emirati Arabic versus Moroccan Arabic, or Quebecois French versus Parisian French, or African American English. It could even be a language spoken by a single speaker, or a language that this speaker uses on a particular occasion, in a particular context. We can describe the systematic properties of each of these ways of speaking, and all of those are different language varieties. Outside of cross-linguistic variation, there are different types of varieties that occur in the same language. First of all, we have varieties spoken by a subset of speakers. Sometimes the speakers only differ in pronunciation, so in their phonetics and phonology. Then we call that variation an accent. Sometimes, though, speakers use different words, different lexical items, or different syntactic structures. And then we call that variety a dialect. We are used to thinking about accents and dialects as something foreign or non-standard. But it's really important to remember that every speaker has a dialect and an accent. Everybody speaks with a particular pronunciation and their particular types of words and syntactic structures. And sometimes we have our own idiosyncratic way of speaking that differs from the way other people, even within our community, speak. If we want to describe the particular language used by an individual speaker, we call that an idiolect. A speech community is the group of people who speak the same language variety. So they speak with the same accent or with the same dialect. But we have to remember that no two people speak in exactly the same way. So even people within the same dialect or within the same accent will each have their own idiolect. This is a complicated question, as when you think about speech communities, there are different ones and we can belong simultaneously to different groups. I can belong to the community of expats and at the same time the community of teachers. And both these identities are going to affect the way that I speak, as well as all of the other types of factors that can be related to the way we speak. At the same time, no speech community is completely isolated from others. So there will also be a lot of overlap between different communities. So when does a dialect start being a completely different language? When do we talk about differences that are normal variation within a speech community? When can we talk about differences across speech communities within the same language? And when do we have to start talking about different languages? Most often, the criterion that is used to decide whether we are talking about two different dialects or two different languages is the criterion of mutual intelligibility. So, can speakers understand each other? If the speakers of the two varieties can understand each other, then we say those varieties are mutually intelligible, and that means we treat them as just different dialects or accents of the same language. However, if the speakers of the two varieties cannot understand each other's variety, then we say they are mutually unintelligible and therefore constitute two separate languages. It's worth mentioning that sometimes this classification is complicated by other factors, as languages are and language varieties are often kept together or divided by other reasons, such as culture, religion, or politics. So sometimes you might come across a situation where two languages sound very different, or two language varieties sound very different. For example, an Emirati Arabic speaker can sometimes perhaps have trouble understanding, for example, an Algerian Arabic speaker. However, we still talk about the Algerian and the Emirati dialect of the same language. On the other hand, sometimes languages can be very, very similar and yet be treated as distinct languages. For example, Czech Republic and Slovakia are two countries that used to be one country. When they separated into the two countries they are today, their languages were also separated. And so we talk about the Czech language and the Slovakian language. However, they are extremely similar. So the difference between a dialect and a language is not always entirely clear-cut. So as you can tell, the distinction between languages and dialects is very complex. In fact, in time, dialects of the same language can become less and less similar. This happens when any community starts living in isolation, where people move to other places. Then what started out as the same language and two different dialects can become two different languages. In fact, this is how we have all our modern languages today. Many languages today come from one language in the past. For example, English and German are closely related languages. We believe that in the distant past, they came from one language. But as different communities spoke different dialects of the language, in time, as they became culturally and geographically separated, the two dialects became so different and so entirely mutually unintelligible that they are now different languages. The same goes for French and Italian, and all of these European languages are related even further in the past to one language that we call Proto-Indo-European. In the same way, Arabic and Hebrew are two languages that come from the same proto-language. In this way, variation that we observe in languages today, over time can lead to historical change and development of new languages.